Before I go on, I'd just like to give you a quick update as to what we've been doing in terms of the NEAA in supporting businesses through this period. Over the past couple of weeks, we've been heavily engaged with our board, local and national government and other automotive forum to look at how we can support members through these difficult times, looking at the types of subjects and programs and policies that were coming out. In terms of the board, we've conducted a series of teleconferences, sharing best practice, market information, raising issues and feeding direct into BAYS, their automotive team, really to look at trying to inform policy and the support that's coming out of government. Done a lot with supply chain programs and members, the smaller SMEs in terms of webinars, and the feedback from that has really been, their focus has been around cash flow and understanding and reacting to the market. In terms of the automotive forum, the likes of SMMT and the Welsh Automotive Forum, we've been doing a lot in terms of what the information they're gleaning out of their memberships, and really sharing best practice across those networks to understand what members need from our types of organisations going forward. It's clear the situation is changing daily, and policy is being updated accordingly. So I would highly recommend you keep abreast of what's going on. The government website is probably the best out there for latest information and support from the government. We do have a dedicated web page on our website for COVID-19. We're trying to keep that up to date with all the information we're getting from local, national government and other support programs. So please use that as a key resource for you as well. As Laura did state, any questions you have during the webinar can be fed in through the chat option on there. And before we proceed, I'd just like to make sure that everyone puts themselves on mute, just so we had a bit of feedback from yesterday's event where we were picking up a lot of noise from people who didn't have their the mobile or the computers on mute. So without further ado, I'd just like to now introduce Ed Duffield, Managing Associate from Womble Dickinson, who's going to take us into the first part of the webinar. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Paul, and afternoon, everybody. Yeah, as Paul said, just sort of as a technical flag, if you not sure how to put yourself on mute, if you sort of move your cursor around, there's a mute button in the bottom left-hand corner. Be really appreciated if you could all put yourselves on mute, so there's no sort of feedback and everyone can hear what's being said. So, as Paul said, I'm Ed Duffield. I'm from the employment team at Womble Dickinson, and what I wanted to cover in this first session was looking at the government's coronavirus job retention scheme, what it is, who's eligible, how it works, and some of the legal issues and implications. Looking firstly at what this job retention scheme is and what's the basic eligibility requirements. As we all know, it was only on the 20th of March, which seems quite a while ago now, but it's only just over a week, the Chancellor announced this coronavirus job retention scheme, which principally is there to provide support for UK employers to continue to pay part of employees' salary during a period when they would otherwise have been laid off or made redundant. And when making that announcement, Rishi Sunak referred to workers who are furloughed, which left a lot of us, me included, scratching our heads as to what does furlough mean. It's not actually a legal term. It sort of has its origins in referring to leave from military duty, but essentially it is any leave of absence from work. And I think the government have been quite deliberate in using this term rather than using layoff, which typically refers to a leave of absence which is unpaid and can also be used interchangeably with redundancy sometimes. So I think the use of furlough is in many respects quite helpful. So where employees are furloughed, their employer can receive reimbursement of part of their wages through this job retention scheme. And before looking in a bit more detail about how the scheme works and importantly how to implement it, I'll firstly cover some of the basic eligibility requirements. So Which employers can participate in the scheme? Well, it is any UK organisation with employees, providing they have created and started a PAYE payroll scheme on or before 28th February 2020 and have a UK bank account. So if you meet those requirements, it applies to businesses, charities, recruitment agencies, or so those employing agency workers through PAYE, and also public authorities. A point to flag on public sector organisations, the guidance makes it clear that the majority of public sector employers are continuing to provide essential public services or contribute to the response to the coronavirus outbreak, and therefore the government expects that the scheme won't be used by many public sector employers. Now this, according to the guidance, will also apply to non-public sector organisations who receive public funding for staff costs, as the expectation is that their money is used to continue to pay staff rather than those employers furloughing staff under the scheme. Similarly, those organisations who are receiving public funding specifically to provide services necessary to respond to the outbreak are also not expected to furlough staff. So, as a result, although public sector employers can participate, it's likely in practice that that's going to be limited. So that's the employers. In terms of employees who's eligible, well, it's helpfully quite wide and covers employees on most types of contracts, so full-time, part-time, agency workers, as I mentioned, if they're not working, and those also on 0 hours or flexible working contracts. What I wanted to look at now on the next slide is the eligibility requirements in a bit more detail. So to be eligible, employees have to be on the PAYE payroll on the 28th of February 2020. So if you have employees who have started work after 28th of February, even if they were offered employment before that date, they won't be eligible to be furloughed and participate in the scheme. The scheme does, however, cover employees who have been made redundant since 28th of February, providing they're rehired by the employer. And that's designed to obviously help those businesses who have already made staff redundant as a reaction to the outbreak. It can also cover staff on unpaid leave or laid off, but again, providing they have been laid off or placed on unpaid leave after the 28th of February. What's important with this scheme is that it doesn't provide an unqualified right for employers to place employees on furlough. It's still subject to the normal principles of employment law. And therefore, as placing staff on furlough and reducing their salary would amount to a variation in the contract of employment, unless you as employer have a contractual right to vary the terms, you'll need to reach agreement with employees before you can place them on furlough. And I'll come on to look at that in a bit more detail shortly. The other important eligibility criterion under the scheme is that whilst furloughed, the employee can't undertake any work for you. So it's not possible to part furlough the employee. If they're undertaking any work for you, even on a part-time basis, they wouldn't be eligible to participate whilst undertaking that work. They would be paid normally under their contract. Employees can undertake some voluntary work, providing that doesn't provide services or generate revenue for or on behalf of the organisation. So it has to be voluntary in the sense that it's something that they're doing that's not really providing any sort of value to you as an organisation. You can't get around it by saying to employees, well, you can do your work on a voluntary basis and I'll just not pay you, and I will pay you and I'll reclaim. So that particular mechanism wouldn't work. Employees can be required to undertake training, including online training, whilst they're furloughed. But if you do require them to undertake training, they must be paid for that, and that must be at least at the national minimum wage rate for that time spent training. One question we're being asked quite frequently is whether employees placed on furlough can work elsewhere. Now, the guidance, which was only issued at the end of last week, simply states that if your employee has more than one employer, they can be furloughed for each job. Each job is separate and the cap applies to each employer individually. Now that doesn't really answer the question, but if you look at the guidance for employees, This states that you can be put on furlough by one employer and continue to work for another if it is permitted within your employment contract, which does suggest that furloughed employees can go and work elsewhere, providing there's no restriction under their employment contract, or if there is a restriction, you agree that they can work elsewhere. So it appears that employees can go and get other work whilst they're furloughed for you, but the important thing is that they don't carry out any work for you whilst they're furloughed. The guidance states that employees will need to be furloughed for a minimum period of 3 weeks, and there's nothing in the scheme guidance that suggests that you can't bring employees back to work after that 3-week period and then furlough them again, which will be helpful where there's some requirement for them to undertake work. But if you bring them back and then furlough them again, the guidance indicates that you have to furlough them for a further minimum 3-week period. Now, we are aware that many employers are seeking greater flexibility in how this operates, and in particular, we know that the CBI are lobbying the government to try and relax that minimum 3-week period of furlough so that they can move employees on and off furlough more frequently to cope with demands in work. We'll obviously have to wait to see what happens there, but the government might be reluctant to introduce further complexity, which may make the scheme more difficult to administer for HMRC, but we'll wait and see. So on the next slide, I set out some of the basic details of the job retention scheme, and I'm not going to go into detail on these because I know Claire from Tait Walker is going to cover these in more detail, so I'll leave these particular elements for Claire to go through. But one thing I would flag up in relation to pensions, it may be worth taking some further specialist advice on this, particularly if you operate a defined benefit scheme, as there might be a need to take a contribution holiday in order to preserve cash flow. Now, I'm not a pension specialist, but there are a number of issues which might arise out of furloughing staff, so it's important to take further advice on that if it's needed. I just briefly flag up that the scheme is in operation for 3 months, and employers can backdate claims to 1st of March 2020. The government have said that the scheme will be extended if necessary. My guess is that it will be extended, particularly if current restrictions are in place. The current information that we've got indicates that the government are going to make a decision on this during the middle of May. So I'll move on to the next slide, because, as I said, Claire's going to sort of go into more detail about what employers can claim back under the scheme. As I mentioned earlier, as the scheme doesn't modify employment law rights, ordinary principles apply. So where you are proposing to place employees on furlough and reduce their pay to 80% of wages, or a maximum of £2,500 a month, this will in most cases amount to a variation of their contractual terms, and so that can only be implemented through agreement with the employee.
Come out of it. I came out from them just...
Sorry, someone is still not on mute. We're hearing your voices of your children. It appears from the participants that might be Hina, H-I-N-A. Sorry to name and shame, but we're just getting voices, hearing your children on the call. If you're able to put yourself on mute, that would be great. Thank you. I say in most cases you'll need agreement, because in some cases employees or employers will have reserved the right to lay off employees or reduce their hours of work, and typically it's employers in the manufacturing sector who have such a provision in their employment contract, as they may need to impose a temporary layoff of staff to cope with fluctuations in workload. So as a first step, it's important to check the contracts of employment of staff you wish to furlough and see whether they contain a right to lay off staff without pay. If it does, then you wouldn't need to reach agreement with employees to place them on furlough and reduce their wages, as you would be entitled to do this under their contract. So it's important to check the contractual terms and see if you have that in there. In other cases, if you don't have the contractual right to lay off or reduce hours or pay, then you'll need to reach agreement with staff to place them on furlough. A point to flag up here is that if you're not proposing to reduce wages, so you're effectively proposing to top up wages to 100%, and you're just looking to reclaim the contribution under the scheme, then there's less of a need to reach agreement because you won't be reducing salary. But in other cases, if you are reducing it down to 80% or the maximum of £2,500 a month, you'll need to reach agreement with employees. So how do you go about this? Well, in an ideal world, you'd need to undertake consultation with staff with a view to reaching agreement. And whilst in some cases that might be possible, in view of the current situation and the likely need to implement this quickly, it's perhaps unlikely that you'll be able to undertake an extensive consultation process. What's clear, however, is that you'll need to communicate with employees, explain the position and the rationale for placing them on furlough and what this means for them. Now, that can be done by way of an announcement, followed up in writing, or a written communication for all staff. Ultimately, what you'll need, ideally, is a written agreement from individual employees confirming their consent to be placed on furlough and to the reduction in salary. And that can be done by them countersigning a letter, or alternatively sending an email confirming that they've read a letter and they've agreed to the terms. That letter or agreement should be in clear terms and state out the conditions which will apply during the furlough period, and it should be made clear that the employees are agreeing to a variation in their contract. Now, many clients are asking, well, why should employees agree to this? Surely they can just say no, and they'll continue receiving their full pay. And whilst that's right, the key leverage here, which is reflected in the scheme guidance, is that you are furloughing employees who would otherwise be at risk of redundancy. This scheme is designed to retain employees and preserve employment. And so ultimately, if employees don't agree to be furloughed, then they could be at risk of redundancy. And of course, it all depends on your own situation in your business and what you're looking at. But if employees are faced with a choice between redundancy and being furloughed with a reduction in pay, but keeping their job, most employees will agree to be furloughed because they're going to be in a better position if they've got employment, albeit on a reduction in pay, rather than being without a job and searching for employment in very difficult circumstances. So you would hope that the majority of employees would agree to this. Other points worth considering, including in the letter, are making it clear that it's only temporary and that you can require employees to return to work subject to the minimum furlough period of 3 weeks, which I mentioned, and also that you could place them on furlough again after they have returned to work. A final point to flag up here in terms of reaching agreement is that for employers with a recognised trade union, it's important to check the terms of the collective agreement. And if that collective agreement covers hours and pay, then you would have to negotiate and agree changes through the trade union following your normal collective bargaining process, rather than negotiate and agree it with employees individually. So that's important if you've got a recognised trade union. So just on this final slide, I just wanted to pick up a few of the more tricky areas where we're seeing a number of queries. And firstly, employees who are on sick leave or report as sick during the furlough period. Well, the guidance states that employees who are on sick leave or self-isolating should be paid statutory sick pay, but can be furloughed after this. Now, this suggests that sickness effectively overrides the furlough, so employees who are already absent due to sickness before going put on furlough should remain on sickness absence and paid statutory sick pay or contractual sick pay if they're entitled to that. Those who are furloughed but then report as sick should also be placed on sickness absence and paid accordingly. Now, what's unclear is whether in those cases you still be able to reclaim contractual sick pay above SSP for employees who are furloughed. My view is that I think that's probably unlikely because they're on sick leave rather than furlough, but we're those sort of kind of details will only work through when the scheme's up and running. What you can, of course, do with employees who are on sick, whether they're on sick leave now or during the period of furlough, is follow your normal absence management procedures and require employees to report their absence, submit sickness certificates in the normal way, and also keep in touch with you as they would normally. For employees who are either on maternity leave or about to start maternity leave or other statutory leave, such as adoption leave, the guidance indicates that they can be placed on furlough. And for employers who pay an enhanced rate of maternity or adoption pay above the statutory rate, this additional payment can be included in the wage costs employers claim through the scheme. What's again unclear is whether employees would need to bring their maternity leave to an end in order to be furloughed. What I would say is that it's important that employees receive their full entitlement to statutory maternity pay and, if payable, contractual maternity pay for the duration of their entitlement, even if they're furloughed. As I mentioned earlier, employees who've been placed on unpaid leave, so laid off without pay, can be furloughed, providing they were placed on unpaid leave after the 28th of February. And that's potentially where the backdating of furlough claims can help. The final one, which I also mentioned earlier, is where there's a requirement for employees to do some work during the period of furlough. And as I explained, employees aren't able to take any work during the period of furlough. And so where this is required, they would need to return to work and be paid as normal, unless you've agreed to pay for the part-time hours that they're working. Number of issues arise out of this. As I mentioned before, the minimum 3-week period of furlough. If you are bringing people back to work, then strictly speaking, if you place them on furlough again, that would have to be for a minimum period of 3 weeks, subject to that being amended or clarified. You may also find you have resentment or issues raised by employees who are required to work whilst others are furloughed and sent home and getting paid for that. One possible way around that is to roster employees. So, a group of employees are rostered so that one's working 1 week, another one working the next week, and so on, so that employees are rostered to work equally, so they don't lose out financially, nor do they feel that they're being taken advantage of at all. So that's something that could be possible. So that's all that I had to cover on the job retention scheme and the legal issues. As Laura said, if people have got any questions, they can submit those by the chat, and we can hopefully pick some of those up at the end. But I'll hand over to Claire and Tait Walker to take you through some of the more of the detail of how the scheme operates. Thank you.
Thanks, Ed. As Ed said, my name's Claire Williams. I am a senior manager at MHA Tait Walker. My responsibility is employment tax. I lead our team in advising on employment tax, and at the moment, obviously, how people can get money back from the government is a big question that we've been having time and time again. We'll move on to the next slide. So what I intend to cover with you today, you'll see there's some areas of overlap with what Ed's already talked about from a legal perspective, but I want to talk about who's covered by CJRS, which is a coronavirus job retention scheme. What can you claim back from the government? How do you go about making a claim from the government? What should you be considering when you're processing your payroll on a weekly, 4-weekly, monthly basis? What is the government thinking at the moment? How can you put effective savings into practice? And then I'm just going to touch on a few other practicalities that we think our clients and people out there running businesses need to be aware of. If we move on to the next slide. As Ed said already, anyone who was included within a UK employer's payroll at 28th of February 2020 can be included within the claim that you make to the government for the grant funding for furloughed employees. Currently, there has been a lot of lobbying of the government where there's been new employments put in place that have commenced since the 28th of February 2020. Or where agreements being reached with people that they are to start employment during March and onwards. And I just want to kind of reiterate what has been said, but the guidance is changing regularly and there's new bits of information released on a regular basis by the government. So it is worth keeping an eye on what's out there. As Paul said, the government guidance is a great place to start, and you do see a lot of announcements coming through. Changes are being made all the time, and currently there's quite a lot of lobbying going on in respect of claims that can be made, so we are expecting to see more and more changes coming through. Although at the same time the government's trying to keep it quite simple so that as many people as possible can benefit. Directors can be included within furloughing and relief can be claimed for their costs, but I'll come on to this in a little bit more detail towards the end of the presentation. We've had a lot of questions about people that are not included on payrolls as self-employed individuals, and there is specific guidance available to self-employed individuals, which is outside of the Coronavirus Joint Job Retention Scheme, but there is some assistance there, so that should be considered. We move on. So what can you claim back as an employer under the Coronavirus Job Retention Scheme? Even helps if I know the name. The grant that you can claim back per employee equates to 80% of the employee's regular wage up to a cap of £2,500 per month, as Ed mentioned. You can also claim back on top of that employer NIC costs and the legal minimum automatic enrolment employer pension contributions. We're not entirely sure whether that'll be based on qualifying earnings pension schemes at the moment. However, we would expect that it'll depend on what your definition of pensionable pay is for the business in terms of what you've agreed with the pension regulator. To qualify for CJRS, employers need to pay the employee the law of at least 80% of their regular wage, or £2,500 per month. The guidance does confirm that bonuses, commissions and fees are not included within the definition of regular wage. We do expect, however, that things like car allowances, regular overtime pay, regular holiday pay will be included within the definition, although this hasn't been confirmed by the government yet. There is also a lot of lobbying of the government at the moment regarding commissions for things like motor dealerships, where people are paid a low base salary and that's topped up by commissions that they receive every single month. Because currently, as I said, the guidance says commissions are not included. I know there's been a lot of lobbying kind of end of last week, beginning of this week, and we are hoping that something will come out to provide further guidance sometime this week, but at the moment that isn't included as far as the guidance goes. We move on to the next slide. So what can you claim back under CJRS? For full-time and part-time employees that receive a salary, you can claim back the salary or the gross regular wage at 80% of what you would normally pay the employee based on the wage at 28th of February. Where somebody is receiving a variable wage, employers can use an average of the hours worked to calculate the amount available to claim. So the 80% grant that you can receive back is based on the higher of the earnings in the same period in the previous year. So if we're looking at April 2020 for furloughing, you compare that back to April 2019 and what the individual received there. And this second bullet point has changed slightly. It is now the average earnings for the 2019-20 tax year, which is pro-rata depending on how many months people have worked. So that has been a slight update that's been put in over the last couple of days. We move on. So I just want to run through a couple of examples. So this is Mr. £42,000 salary. This person is obviously paid above the £2,500 cap, and I've chosen this number deliberately just to illustrate how that works. So this person ordinarily receives £3,500 per month as a regular wage. So if an employer chose to furlough him at his regular wage, I've shown what that looks like in the first column. If the employer chooses to pay him 80% of his wage, he'd get £2,800 per month. And if they furlough at the cap of £2,500, then obviously his gross wage would be £2,500 per month. I've used that to then work out what the amount of grant available to this employer would be. So the grant available is based on that £2,500 plus the employer NIC that would be paid on that £2,500, which is £244, plus the automatic enrolment minimum contributions, which I've worked out here based on qualifying earnings, which would be £59. So in this scenario, for Mr. £42,000, the total monthly amount that the employer can claim back from the government under the CJRS is £2,803. So obviously, it doesn't matter what wage is being paid to this individual, the amount they can claim back is £2,803. So if you continue to pay this person their regular wage, the employer will end up funding £1,168 of that wage. And if you choose to furlough them at 80% of their wage, because the rest of the workforce has been, for example, then the employer will have to fund £350 of that. If we move on. I've then taken an example based on somebody who receives variable pay. So I've looked back to month 1 for this person of 2019-20 to look at what they received, and they received £1,500. When I've looked at the average over the 2019-20 tax year, they've actually received £1,650, and that reflects the fact that some people's work is seasonal even. So during the summer months, for example, somebody might earn more than they would have received in April last year. When we look at the amount that can be claimed under furlough, under the CJRS, it's going to be 80% of the higher of those two figures. So it's 80% of the 1,650 that I've calculated here. The employer NIC and minimum employer pension contributions have been worked out, which means that the grant available for this individual will be £1,425 per month, which means in the two scenarios, if you carry on paying the average wage or the month 1 wage that this person received last year, the employer would fund £210 of it or £385 of it. Whereas if you furlough 80% of the higher wage, then everything will be covered by the claim from the government. We'll move on to the next slide. So the question on everybody's lips is, how do you claim back under the coronavirus job retention scheme? The government is working on a portal to enable claims to be made. Unfortunately, obviously this all came at quite short notice, and there wasn't the ability for the claims to be made straight away. The government have confirmed that they're working night and day and that the portal will be available by the end of April 2020. They hope it'll be available before that, but obviously we'll have to watch this space. This does mean that employers will be claiming for their grants retrospectively, which means that you will be paying employees and claiming the money back after you've paid the employees, which obviously results in a delay for you to access the funding that's available to you as an employer. What we would suggest here is that other cash flow assistance is considered in the meantime. That might include things like arranging time to pay arrangements with HMRC to defer some of the tax due. It might be looking at things like, have you got any ability to make a research and development claim that will reduce the amount that you owe HMRC and can be offset against the PAYE that you might owe, for example? Can you claim capital allowances for some of the plant that you've put in your factories and things over the last year or so? Have you considered whether you can approach the bank for any funding? And also there's a coronavirus business interruption loan scheme that it may be worth considering. So it's worth having a look at anything that's out there and that's available to you to help with the cash flow in the meantime. It is crucial that you continue with compliance requirements. So obviously I'm talking here about employment, so I'm looking at the payroll steps that you need to think about. So we'll move on to the next slide and chat through some of them. So throughout the period of furlough, for employees that you're putting on furlough, you'll need to keep records of dates that people went on furlough, started furlough, and the amounts that are being paid to those furloughed employees. As an employer, you must continue to pay the employees via the payroll system as you normally would on the normal payday. The employee will still suffer income tax and national insurance on the payments they receive from you in the same way as they would on normal salary. The employees, again, will need to make student loan contributions if that applies to them. They will also be required to make their employee pension contributions on the amounts they're receiving. As the employer, you'll be required to file RTI returns with HMRC on your normal dates as you normally would. And you will be required to pay across PAYE and NIC to HMRC. Obviously, I've mentioned time to pay arrangements. It may be worth considering whether you can delay the payments of PAYE and NIC. Also, the employer will be required to submit pension uploads and make payments to pension providers. Again, if you're having cash flow difficulty, you may be able to enter into discussions with your pension provider to delay those payments. If we move on. So what is the government's current thinking here? They're expecting employers to go through the process of identifying employees, communicating with them and implementing furlough where possible or where they need to. They're expecting employers to defer tax where they can through time to pay arrangements, which will be a case of contacting a dedicated helpline or speaking to your advisors who should be able to help with that, to put off the payments as far as HMRC will let you. They'll be expecting you to speak to your ordinary banks to see if they can help you with funding and to access the coronavirus business interruption loan scheme where possible. And they would also expect you to be making the most of other tax reliefs, as I've already mentioned. We move on. So effective savings guidance for furlough. You need to be working out what your policy is if you haven't already. I know a lot of employers have already considered the people that they might need to furlough and already put people on furlough, but work out your policy, communicate it and implement it quickly with your employees. Review it every 3 weeks as a minimum. In reality, a lot of employers will be reviewing it on a daily basis, never mind a weekly basis, but keep an eye on it, make sure it's still working for your business. Consider if there's any people that you have laid off already that you might want to re-employ as a result of furlough having come out, and that's why there's the ability to backdate, because people obviously made drastic decisions, but it might be that ideally they would have liked to keep those employees on. So have a look and see if there's anybody that you'd like to make a change for there. If we move on. And just some practicalities to be aware of, and this has come from a lot of the conversations that we've had with our own clients and just generally with other associations that we've been helping out. Directors, as I mentioned at the front, do qualify for the coronavirus job retention scheme, but we're urging businesses to consider what this means for them commercially. The director must stop working completely in the business to be eligible for the scheme. And as Ed's advised, as Ed's previously advised, everybody needs to be inactive. However, guidance does suggest that where directors are undertaking their statutory duties, but they're not providing services to the business or revenue generating work isn't being completed, then that should be okay. We're just urging clients to think, can I continue to run my business if I'm furloughed as a director? Other employer provided benefits. Obviously think about company cars that you're providing to staff, things like private medical benefits, you want to continue to provide them. If not, there are certain actions that you need to take, which includes the variations to contract of employment that Ed's already mentioned. There has been some guidance released on company cars this morning. The rules for company cars have always been that if a car is unavailable to an employee for a period of at least 30 days, then there isn't a company car benefit for that period or beyond, if that's the case. However, HMRC have confirmed that for that to apply, the car must be unavailable, which means either the employee hasn't got the car at all, or they've handed back all keys and fobs and anything that can make that car go, which might be a bit difficult to implement in practice. So it's likely that those benefits in kind will continue. Salary sacrifice schemes, where most of the salary sacrifice schemes that we see these days tend to be pension salary sacrifice schemes. If you have a salary sacrifice scheme in place that you haven't varied as a result of furlough, then in theory the employer's signed up to pay to enhance the employee pension contributions that are being paid. The government will only reimburse the employer for the statutory minimum employer pension contributions, so you might want to have a think about the impact that may have on the business. Because if you have a salary sacrifice scheme in place, you are bound as the employer to continue providing the benefit that you've agreed to provide. We've already mentioned backdating of furlough for employees that you may have made redundant. Another thing to note there, we've mentioned a few times that employees, to go on furlough, employees need to be inactive. I've had a few clients say, oh, well, we closed the shops on, say, the 24th of March. Can we go back to the beginning of March for furlough? Obviously, the answer to that is no, the employees had to be inactive. If you have certain employees during that period that were inactive, it may be possible to go back further for them. And Ed's already covered off national minimum wage, he's covered off other statutory benefits like sick pay, maternity pay and things like that, and obviously he's mentioned pregnant employees. So that's it from me.